This comment is a reinterpretation of history. It's actually a rewriting of history, and it's exactly what is brainwashed into most of our culture, and this is what the atheists today believe. They actually think that this is true. Let's read this. The standard we use today is the reason and logic born of the Age of Enlightenment. It is the same system of beliefs that gave rise to modern Western science, and is the pillar of modern secular law, the Constitution, for example. There is nothing inherently wrong with personal religion and faith. Well, I agree with that part. The problem only arises when religion intrudes on the public arena and threatens secularism. Separation of church and state. I am sick and tired of hearing that because they don't even know where that comes from. It is not found in the Constitution. It was actually in a letter by Thomas Jefferson defending religious freedom. He was trying to keep the government out of the church, not the church out of the government. Jefferson was not against Christianity being any part of the government. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, devout Christians, founders of America. So this is a complete revisionist propaganda. That's all it is. It is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Not only that, it's actually an idea born of the Bible, not of the Enlightenment. Both the idea of the secular was coined by a Christian in the 5th century by St. Augustine of Hippo, and the idea of the separation of church and state is found in the Old Testament when God divided the kingship from the priesthood. God did not allow kings to be priests and priests to be kings, because he didn't want a corrupt king corrupting the nation through the priests. That does not mean the priests were not allowed to influence the king. In fact, the kings would often look to the priests who had the law of God, who could tell the king what was ethical and right to do, how he should lead his people. We also see this again in the New Testament with Jesus' own words, saying that Christians are to be in the world, but not of the world, and also that his kingdom is not of this world. You know, Christians were never commanded by Jesus Christ to take the world by force. In fact, he said the opposite. The idea of the secular was coined by Augustine when he understood the eschatological tension between the future coming of God's kingdom on earth and the time we live in now, where human society and human government is the best that we have. And the secular is meant to be a middle ground between the sacred, which belongs to God, and the profane, the things that are offensive to God. The secular is meant to be a place where Christians and non-Christians can both live without being an offense to God and without being an offense to those without God, a middle ground, so to speak. And it is just as important for the Christians as it is for non-Christians. Why? Because it is through the secular that Christians are allowed to interact with non-Christians in the world, just as they were commanded to do in order to reach the lost and save them. So the secular is a Christian idea, allowing Christians to function in a world of non-Christians. It was a Christian idea, not born of the Age of Enlightenment, many hundreds, centuries before. I'd like to introduce to you guys 4 definitions that caused Augustine to come up with the idea of the secular: the church, the state, the city of God, and the city of man. He wrote extensively on these topics in his work called The City of God. I recommend it to every Christian. The church is the body of born-again believers who are on a pilgrimage to the city of God, which I'll define in a moment. The state is the secular, in which Christians and non-Christians live in under human government. The city of God is God's kingdom that Jesus Christ will set up, who will rule and reign for all eternity. That is the ultimate end of man and the very purpose of man, to participate in that kingdom. The city of man, however, does not acknowledge God as the ruler of the city, and man has set himself up as ruler on the earth and has created institutions that are contrary to the ways of God. This is distinct from the state and the secular. The city of man is distinctly those things that man has set up that are contrary to the things of God, such as homosexual marriage or abortion or pornography, these things that God finds abhorrent. Now, this comment that we've made this video about makes the mistake of what I'm going to call modernity's distortion of Augustine. The new definition of secularism, which has come to mean in the 19th century, the idea that religion is harmful and useless, and that the material world in this age and this life is all that exists, and therefore should be our only focus, makes the same mistake as the triumphalists of the church. By making secularism ignore the eschatological tension and collapsing it, and the difference here is only placing the state in place of the church. Whereas the church in triumphalism was to take over all political structures, now the state is to take over all political policy, removing the church and anyone who has religious or traditional values from even attempting to get their views heard or discussed in the secular arena, deeming religion dangerous and religious people dangerous. So both this view of secularism and triumphalism both have the same problem, a false eschatology, which is about the future, that does not preserve the tension between this age and the age to come. One denies the future, and the other says the future is here now, and both therefore turn to totalitarianism. After all, this idea of the secular and the champion being science, what it will eventually turn into is eugenics. We're going to turn it inward. After we've conquered nature and the outward, we're going to begin to try and conquer human nature. And once we begin doing that, this is what C.S. Lewis talked about in The Abolition of Man. He talked about those who have this authority to curb men's behavior and define for us what is right and is wrong. They are the conditioners. And if they get to define what is right or is wrong, or how a human ought to be, if they start playing with our genetics, then they really have conquered humanity. They've become the masters of humanity, and the few rule over the many. And what once was man's conquest of nature through the sciences has actually become nature's conquest of humanity. For all humanity will be subject to these conditioners, and the conditioners are subject to their own nature. And suddenly man is now enslaved by the sciences that once were meant to set him free. Without the religious ideals getting in the way of a takeover of these conditioners, these bureaucrats, these government officials in high places, and the sciences that get to treat us as experiments, without something getting in the way, such as a moral code or an obedience to God or a telos for humanity, a purpose that says that our ultimate end is not in this life, that we don't need to invest all our chips here and now, that we do have a future to look forward to which should govern our behaviors, and that we're not to temper with humanity and redefine marriage, and on it goes. Without a proper biblical understanding of humanity, we cease to be human and we become slaves. Slaves of our own instincts and natures and depravity and sin. And that's why this idea of science as this endless progress of man attempting to conquer nature is so dangerous. You know, when we build a plane, the plane does not conquer nature. Rather, a plane is better the more it contours to the laws of nature and uses those laws to its own advantage, like aerodynamics. You know, if we truly understood human nature, we'd know that it was designed in a specific way, and that if we obey the way in which we were designed to achieve the very purpose for which we existed, we would find our optimal condition for existence. So I'm not anti-science, I'm anti the philosophy of secularism, modern secularism, and their view of science. Now, this myth that the secular is what gave rise to the sciences is completely false. The sciences were invented because of the idea of the cosmos, which is a Greek word, which essentially meant that the entire order of things, that natural law, was created by a lawgiver, a rational mind, and that we were made rational and able to appreciate the rational order of the cosmos, which had a unified law that would not change tomorrow because God had made it in a very specific, rational way, and that since God is still on the throne, it would still be functioning tomorrow and the next day, and that's why we could make scientific predictions. And to suggest otherwise is simply to ignore the actual history and those who first began doing science. I'd also like to refute the modern myth of man's progress that says, you know, we started as stupid, primitive animals, and now we're getting smarter. And this invention of science, well, now we're getting better into an infinite, glorious future, when in fact, ever since the advent of science, history has only become darker, the rejection of traditional values, the rejection of God, the increasing depravity, the scale of war. It's only getting worse. This century, specifically, has probably been the darkest time in world history. Yeah, that's right. Let's use, for example, the Nazis. I know I bring them up a lot, but they make a good case. The Nazis were very scientific. They loved science. The problem is it was science without morality, and morality is not a scientific endeavor. So this idea of secularism, which is purely rational and scientific, well, it actually becomes utterly irrational and immoral without Christian virtue. And let me show you. The Nazis killed people for science. They tortured people for science. You guys have heard of the Nazi doctors and all the things they did. Now, they were so scientific that they were unhindered by concepts such as morality, which is obviously a non-scientific principle. After all, you can't weigh or measure right and wrong. The Nazis wanted to conquer nature, even human nature, and thus eugenics, which is another big, scary time of this century. The great irony is that in their quest to be scientific, they became far more like dark wizards, whose goal was to make nature surrender to their wills at the cost of their souls. Magic is usually viewed as the enemy of science, but there was actually very little magic in the Dark Ages. The real heyday of magic was the 16th and 17th century. It was the twin of science, born of the same womb, though it was obviously far less successful, because science worked and magic did not. Both, however, were born of the same sentiment: to dominate nature, to become the masters of nature, to make nature bend to our wills. In that way, the Nazi view of science is much the same as the magic that was born of the same century, and it was even willing to do the disgusting and the impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is that science without religion is immoral, and religion without science is not factual. I happen to believe in both, and I don't think that we need to make this stark divide between the two as this user seems to be suggesting. We need religion to keep our science in check. We need to know what is or is not ethical. We need to know the purpose of man so we don't go beyond where we ought to go. Should we really be creating atomic bombs? Is that really the best way to go? The Bible predicts we're going to wipe ourselves out with them. I recommend reading Ezekiel and Zechariah. Jesus said if he does not return to stop us, we are going to wipe out all flesh on the earth. Amazing that the Bible knew this. You know, even 200 years ago, the idea of wiping out all flesh on earth with muskets or bows and arrows is impossible. The Bible predicts in the end times man, due to his increase in knowledge, will have the ability to wipe out all flesh on the earth, and it's going to happen. That is where science without religion ends. Anyways, in conclusion, the idea that the Enlightenment was all peaches and cream is simply false. History has gotten so much darker ever since the Enlightenment. The scale of war in the 20th century, the amount of people killed, thanks to our new ways of thinking, the rise of communism, socialism, Nazism, the rejection of Judeo-Christian values, all of it, thanks to this brainwashed, revisionist view of history. Absolutely tragic. Absolutely tragic. So what this commenter subscribes to is the idea that we need to suppress and remove the church to save the secular. And what I'm arguing is this: if you want to save the secular, you need the church. We're the ones who came up with it, and we're the ones who can preserve it by our traditional Christian values and virtues. As soon as we get rid of those, we're headed towards a self-destructive future that will look far worse than anything Hitler could have mustered. The great irony of this entire situation is as America becomes increasingly hostile and intolerant of Christians and ignorant of their Christian heritage, they become increasingly tolerant of another religion, which I dare not name, which makes no distinction between the secular and the religious, and they attempt to actually get their religious law enforced in America and around the world so that both those who adhere to their religion as well as those who do not have to be under the yoke of their religion. Christianity does not believe in creating a theocracy on earth, although I admit the Catholic Church has attempted that in the past, and we all know how that turned out. Christians appreciate the secular. We want to preserve the secular. And yet, the great irony of this entire situation is also that the atheists want to enforce this sort of non-religious stance, politically speaking, banning religion. They want to become essentially the state religion, atheism. They want to enforce it, and they have in the schools by teaching kids evolution and introducing to children in kindergarten to the idea that, same-sex marriage is just an alternative lifestyle. They're indoctrinating and brainwashing our culture to reject Christianity, to reject truth, in favor of this new dogmatic atheism, which is a religion, frankly, and it makes the same error as the Catholic Church did. It wants to have absolute dominance over every other worldview. And when it does that, it's going to become no better, and actually far worse, thanks to science, because science is a great tool, but it's also a tool that can be used for great destruction. It will be used against those who oppose them. And in this way, this new dogmatic atheism is no better than that religion that I dare not name. They are opposites, and yet they're two sides of the same coin. One doesn't allow for the secular, and the other doesn't allow for religion. In Christianity, we have both, the perfect balance. And that's how man was meant to be, a natural being on earth with their heart and mind and soul in heaven.